Okay, bonjour, hello, virtual world. I must admit, this is my first time doing a virtual conference sectional, so bear with me. My name is Megan Wong, and I teach French in Montana. So I'm a member of the Montana Association of Language Teachers and representing PNCFL in this conference. And the title of my sectional today is Cultivating a Target Language Community in the Classroom. If you have any questions during this or after this, or you just want to stay in touch, you've got my email down there, as well as my handle for both Snapchat and Instagram, which I all check regularly. So feel free to reach out to me. I love connecting with other language teachers a lot. So, all right. The objective for today's sectional is to create the foundation for building a target language community in our classrooms, particularly focused on encouraging student use of the target language. For the presentation today, I have a couple links for you. First and foremost, the bit.ly to follow along with this presentation, the Google Slides, if you are interested in doing that. I know that I personally like to do that when I am looking at a presentation. So you've got the bit.ly there for you. It's really important to note that the bit.ly web address is case sensitive. So it's really important that the NFLC is all caps. You also have the QR code if you'd prefer to follow along on a tablet or your phone. There's a Padlet link for just a Padlet with all external links and resources and things that I reference throughout this presentation. So you have those all in one handy place for you. And then the final link is for a Padlet where you guys are welcome to post questions, thoughts, ideas, interact with each other. You can comment on each other's posts. You can share resources, whatever you want to do on that Padlet. It's just kind of there to give you guys a space to interact with each other. Because when I do presentations in real life, I give the audience, I guess, lots of opportunities to discuss and interact. And since we can't really do that in real time today, I just want to make sure that you guys have the space available to do that. And I will really encourage you to take advantage of that, because discussion is a really important facet of learning. So again, I really encourage you to take advantage of that. You see that little pencil down there? I put that on slides throughout the presentation just as a reminder for me and for you to pause there, look at that question, maybe journal in a notebook, handwritten, type up some notes in a document, post to that Padlet, whatever you want to do. I just think that whenever I put that pencil up there, it's a nice reminder to maybe pause the video, kind of take a few minutes to reflect, because I'm not going to be embedding the time to pause and reflect within this because it's a short 30 minutes, but I would encourage you, since you'll be doing this asynchronously, to pause the video yourself and give yourself that time to take a minute, reflect, and think, and maybe even discuss with some people. So today I am going to be addressing two major questions: why create a target language community and how to create a target language community. I think it's really important. I like to start out every presentation reminding you all that there's no one right way to do something. And I really think with professional development, it's about adapting, not adopting. So today I'm really just going to talk about what I do and successes that I have found. And I hope that you guys will find some useful things that you can adapt for your own classrooms. I just want to be clear that I'm not trying to tell anybody how to teach or what they should be doing in their classroom. I'm just sharing successes that I have had in my classroom. So I would like you to take a moment, either on the Padlet or on a notebook or whatever, to just think about what's your why. And in particular, I mean, what's your why for being in this specific sectional? Like, why did this title catch your eye? And how do you think it relates, this idea of cultivating a target language community? How does that relate to some of your goals for your students in your classroom? How does that relate to things that you want to promote in your classroom or things that you want to alleviate or ease in your classroom? And what's important to you when you think about why you might be interested in cultivating a target language community? So again, I'm not going to pause here and give you the time to reflect, but you feel free to pause the video. So likewise, I'm going to share with you what my why is for when I began really dedicating myself to cultivating a target language community in my classroom. I really wanted to promote my students' ability to be their authentic selves in the language. I wanted to cultivate the extremely important skill of circumlocution. And ultimately, once I started doing this, the results that I saw in my students and their abilities to authentically communicate in the language kind of is just sold me on what I've been doing. And I don't think I'll ever go back. So now I'm going to kind of go through each one of those a little more in depth. So why I think it's really important and why being our authentic selves in the language is a motivating factor to me has to do with my own personal experience in my first real time abroad. So I teach French, so a lot of my examples involve French. But when I moved to France, I really struggled to find my personality in the language and to be who I am in another language. And while I think that a certain amount of that is inevitable, I really want to help my students not feel that same feeling that I felt. And I really truly believe that even a level 1 student can make jokes and really present themselves for who they are with limited language. And I want to give my students lots of opportunities and lots of permission to be their authentic selves in my classroom. There's a couple ways that I really promote being our authentic selves in the classroom, and one is to teach teenage language, and the other is to lean into organic moments. And these really actually kind of go often together. So I like to teach my students things that I think that they would say in real life. So I'm always looking for French slang and things like that to try to help them talk like actual teenagers would in a French-speaking community. And then another thing is leaning into organic moments. So when you have those moments in class when kind of a funny thing arises and a student's telling a story or they're trying to express themselves, if you can kind of lean into that and give your students plenty of language as to how to explain that, how to react to it, funny things to say, a lot of things my students know how to say, like, I'm kidding, like it was just a joke, things like that, or they know how to call each other like dirty cheaters when we're playing a game or something like that. So I really try to lean into that psychosocial language and not just keep everything kind of to a more academic tone. So now I would like for you to pause the video and take a moment to reflect on what you can start or continue to do in your classroom to enable and encourage students to be their authentic selves. So I've talked about being our authentic selves, and the next thing I'm going to talk about in terms of why I think it's so important to cultivate a target language community is to build the skill of circumlocution. I really truly think that circumlocution is the #1 most important skill. So here's a video about circumlocution. It's like borderline appropriate, so I'm not going to play it here, but it's up to you to choose whether this would be something that you would show your students or not. But I think that the first thing to recognize with circumlocution is that a lot of people, especially outside sort of the language community, don't have any idea what this word means, and your students are probably in that boat unless you've already taught them before. So circumlocution, right, is that ability to kind of talk around a word, especially a word that you can't remember or you don't know. And we do this in our native languages all the time, right? Like anytime I'm in a sentence speaking English and I come up against a word and it's like, oh my gosh, I just forgot this word, you use circumlocution to talk around it, and generally the person you're communicating with will be like, oh yeah, this word. So that's what circumlocution is, and I think that it's a really important, if not the most important, skill for language learners to learn. I remember when I saw this quote from, she was Annabelle Allen at the time she wrote this quote, now she's Annabelle Williamson of La Maestra Loca, and I remember when I saw this quote, I'm not fluent, I'm just an expert at circumlocution. And this really was an aha moment for me when I read this quote, because I think it's really important to explain to our students that, especially as language learners, you're never going to know all the words, right? Like I've been studying French. I studied French for 10 years. I've lived in France, and there are moments, there are conversations, there are topics that I get into and I'm like, oh no, I don't know the word. Like I can think of a specific example that I didn't know the word for deductible, like insurance deductible in French. And so I talked around it, I explained what it was, and then my French friends were able to give me that word in the middle of a conversation rather than me having to pull out my phone and look up the word. So I think that that ability to talk around a word that you can't remember or don't know is the most important language skill, because you will always be able to keep the conversation flowing if you're able to do that, the communication going if you're able to do that. So if you take a moment to just reflect on how do you integrate circumlocution into your classroom currently? I integrate circumlocution in many ways, but here are a few. First and foremost, I introduce it to my students and I remind them of the importance of it every single year. That is actually a link to the presentation that I use to introduce circumlocution to my students. You're welcome to check it out. It's linked there. It's also linked in the Padlet. I'm not going to open it right now, but basically it explains what is circumlocution, why is it so important, when do we use it, how do we use it, and I just kind of get my students to understand that I think it's the most important skill that they can develop. Another way that I integrate circumlocution into my classroom is by modeling it. If there is a new word that I'm introducing to my students, I always start by circumlocuting it. And I do it really, really intentionally. And I wait until I start seeing those light bulbs go off in my students' minds. And actually, when they get that light bulb of like, I know the word she's talking about, they actually get a little hit of dopamine in their brain, which makes learning actually kind of addictive, similar to drugs or chocolate. Anyway, I digress. So I model it all the time to have them get a lot of input of that, and also to give them the success of figuring out a word that I'm trying to describe. The third thing that I do is I integrate a lot of circumlocution sentence stems in activities, in practice, and in posters around my room. So one of the ways that I do it is just by reviewing and writing these sentences out a lot. So we starts with it's a word, it's a phrase, it's a sentence, it's an expression, it's a description, it's an action, it's an object, it's an expression that means, it's similar to, it's the opposite of, right? So those kinds of things are what are those sentence stems, and really using those a lot is going to help your students be able to circumlocute. And then finally, we just review circumlocution, we use circumlocution, we encourage circumlocution all the time. A great way to integrate circumlocution is just via games. There's, you think of like Taboo, basically that game, if you're familiar with it, is a game of circumlocution. So if you just literally Google circumlocution games, you will have endless options of things to do in your classroom. All right, so another moment for reflection. So what can you start or continue to do in your classroom to instruct, review, use, and or encourage circumlocution? All right, so in terms of my why for creating a target language community, I talked about the importance of being our authentic selves, the importance of circumlocution, and now I'm just going to touch briefly on the results. Obviously, the results were something I was hoping for when I first tried this, and now that I have really been focusing on this for a few years, the results are why I keep focusing on this, because they are literally mind-blowing. I think that my students' ability to circumlocute has raised their confidence in their ability to have a conversation. Because as before, when circumlocution wasn't as important of an aspect in my classroom, when I would be having a conversation with students and they come up to a word that they can't remember or they don't know, they go into like panic mode and the affective filter rises and then they can't think about anything. Whereas now my students are so used to circumlocuting, so used to saying in the target language, that it's really easy and natural for them to talk around words that they don't remember, they don't know. And then when I'm able to understand what they're talking about and give them the word, they get another kind of dose of confidence. And I've just seen their ability to participate in conversations with ease just skyrocket. And for me, those results are what keep me focused on this particular aspect of my classroom from year to year. All right, so this is all great in theory, but how do we actually do this? How do we actually keep the students in the target language? When do I personally start holding my students accountable for target language use? What about the student who refuses and all that stuff, right? Like, how do we actually do this? So I'm going to touch on 4 different points of how I do this. Number 1, I have what I call 100% French. So remember, I'm a French teacher. If you're Spanish, you'd put Spanish in there. If you teach Japanese, you'd put Japanese in there. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about how I sell it to my students. I'm going to talk about how I incentivize it. And finally, how I set clear expectations about the use of L1, which in my classroom is English. So if you hear me refer to English and that's not your L1, you can, just like with French, you can sub in whatever the L1 is in your classroom. So 100% French. First and foremost, we as the teacher must model extensive use of the target language, like above all else. I read a research article a couple years ago, and I'm going to try to find it and link it in that Padlet. But basically it said, the more that the teacher code switches, the more that the teacher shifts from target language to the L1, the more that time students will spend in L1 also. And their theory behind that is just because even if you're explicitly telling students that they have to stay in the language, every time you shift into L1, you are sort of subconsciously giving your students to speak in L1 as well. So if we want our students to stay in the target language, the first and most important thing is that we are staying in the target language. All right, the next thing about 100% French and why it was in quotes is that it's not actually 100%. The reason that I call it 100% French is 2 reasons. First of all, Act Full really encourages that the teacher and the students are in 90% or more of the target language. And for me, just on a psychological level, if I'm saying 90% to myself, that means I'm giving myself automatically permission to speak in L1. And in a classroom like mine where it's 50 minutes, that means I would get 5 minutes in L1. Well, it's really easy for that percentage to start easily creeping up from 10%, 15%, 20, 25. Next thing I know, I'm like half in English during a class period, and I really don't want to do that. So if I think about it to myself as 100% French, I'm so cognizant of when I'm speaking English and when I'm using L1 that I think I really end up closer to that 90% target than if I think about it as a 90% target. So really, it's not 100% French. It's just that's the way that I think about it. Another thing that's important is that this is not a no English or a no L1 rule. This is a 100% target language rule, which I think is really important. I have students in my classes, and I'm sure you do too, that are native speakers of all kinds of languages aside from English. Even though the majority of my students' L1 is English, I have students whose L1 is Chinese or Mandarin, and students whose L1 is Spanish, and a bunch of different things. And so for me, I don't want to give those students permission to get off the hook either. Like, they can't speak Mandarin or Spanish in my class and not because they're not meeting that expectation of 100% target language. So another point that's really important in terms of why I say 100% French is that if I allow English in my classroom, if I allow L1, we just won't circumlocute, right? Like if I give myself permission to just say the English word rather than circumlocuting around it when I'm modeling for my students, that undermines the importance of circumlocution. And likewise, if I let my students just say, comment dit-on flag en français? How do you say flag in French? They're not circumlocuting around the word flag. They're just saying the English word. And so that brings me to my third point, which is why I ban how do you say insert English word in French, right? In French, it's like comment dit-on flag en français. And I ban that in my classroom because that doesn't encourage circumlocution. Instead, what I want my students to say is like, what's the word for, and they could point to the flag in the corner of the room, or they could say like, what's the word for the rectangle represents a country symbol, America, red, white, blue, stars, whatever they could do to describe it. And I'd be like, oh, the flag. I really want to encourage them to use those descriptive terms to do that circumlocution rather than just saying, comment dit-on flag en français? And also, it's not authentic to do that. And then the final thing, 100% French, I start this at the end of week 1 of French 2. So I do variations of this in my level 1 classes, but by level 2, I really just push the target language hard. All right, so I've talked a little bit about 100% French, and now I'm going to talk about how I sell this idea to my students. So, just like with most things with teenagers, if you don't sell it, they won't buy it. So, first and foremost, it's all about convincing them that circumlocution is the most important skill for language learners. I truly believe that. And if I want my students to be invested in staying in the target language, I need to convince them that circumlocution is really important as well. Another thing that I use to sell it is by the end of level 2, we're really hoping that most of our students are able to perform at the intermediate low level. And according to ACTFL's performance guidelines, intermediate language learners no longer revert to their L1, or in the case of most of my students, English. So in order for our students to truly be operating at that intermediate low level by the end of year 2, they cannot be reverting to English all the time. They need to be able to stay in the language. And so yeah, that's pretty much a big reason why I start in level 2. And then of course, again, in order to sell extensive target language use to our students, we have to be extensively using the target language too. We got to practice what we preach. Okay, so incentivize it. I think that this is an important aspect of the language. I know that extrinsic motivation isn't always the best, and many people are very against extrinsic motivation, and that is fine. Again, I'm not trying to tell you what to do in your classroom. I'm just talking about what has worked in mine, and I choose to incentivize use of the target language in my classroom. You do what you please, obviously. So I incentivize this in a couple different ways depending on the level, but I'm just going to kind of cover the bare bones. And then I have linked to a document there, which is also in that Padlet, of like kind of a very detailed explanation of what I do. So feel free to check out that document if you're looking for more details. Feel free to email me or message me if you have any questions about how I do this. Again, if you don't want to incentivize it, that's totally fine. I find that it helps me hold students accountable more. I guess for me, it's more an accountability piece rather than a true incentive piece, but I want to offer some kind of reward. Anyhow, so I've actually changed my system a bit over the years, but I'm just going to go with a very simple one. So what I do, I choose a 5-letter word. I used to write French on the board, F-R-E-N-C-H. Now I write parle, which is speak in French. Every time I hear a student use any language other than English, I just erase a letter. I don't make a big ordeal about it. I don't publicly shame them. I'm not like, oh, class, Todd spoke English. Like, I don't do that. I just casually erase a letter. And then at the end of a class period, however many letters they have left go towards a running class point tally, which is what you can see in the picture on the right. So that's like hour 1 at that point had 47 points. Hour 2 at that point, oh man, this is making me do quick math. I had 39 points. So it kind of creates a little bit of competition between class periods, first of all, which I like, but also it's just a really clear, obvious, easy way to hold students accountable for speaking English. And then I would assign a point value at the end of those, I just be like, okay, after 100 points, you get to have a festival day, which is a day in my classroom where we learn about a festival from a French-speaking community, and or students will bring in food. And I've done parties in the past where it's just a free day. I've done movie days. I've let students vote on what we do once we get to 100 points. I've done all kinds of stuff. And again, it's not really about the party. It's more about holding kids accountable on a daily basis. And then the party or whatever reward you offer at the end is just kind of a bonus. That's my perspective on it. And I've also done this in several different ways. I don't think it's about the system, but I do think it helps to have some sort of accountability system in place. So that's just my thoughts on that. All right, the final thing that I think is really important in terms of actually encouraging, extensive use of the target language in your classroom is having clear expectations about L1, or in my classroom, that's English. So I do use English on occasion for comprehension checks where I will say, hey, students, what does this word mean in English? And I'll do that in French. I'll be like, classe, que veut dire livre en anglais, which is like, and then they would be like, book, because that's what the word livre means. So I might do that. I also do comprehension checks where it's just like, do you understand this word? That does not give them permission to speak English. That's just yes or no. So that's one time that my students might use English. Another time that we use English is any time that I'm talking about or explaining assessments and proficiency. So when I'm telling my students about what's coming up on this assessment, how I want them to fill out a form or whatever it happens to be, I'm doing that in English. When I'm talking about their proficiency levels, like, okay, I'm expecting an intermediate low if you want to get a B, and an intermediate mid if you want to get an A, or however that works, I'm always explaining that in English. And mostly that's because I want to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to understand what I'm saying, and that the expectations around the task are not what are going to hold, like a student's not going to do worse on the assessment just because they don't understand the task. So it really hones in on the fact that what's important is your language ability on the task, not your ability to understand my explanation of the assessment in French. So that's just my own personal take on that. And then the final thing where it is obviously fine to use English is in an emergency. Like if Bobby is having a seizure in the back of the classroom, like I want you to let me know immediately in English. So those are kind of how I set out clear expectations for using L1 English in my case in my classroom. And I think it's really important to be explicit about that. All right, so now take a moment, please, to pause the video and either jot down some notes or maybe post to the Padlet about what you can start or continue to do in your classroom to further encourage and or incentivize the use of the target language by students. Okay, so that is all that I have for you today. I really am posting this Padlet again because I'm really encouraging you guys to interact. I think it's been, a tough 3 months for a lot of us not getting to interact as much as we are used to. And so I would really encourage you to post to that Padlet, respond to some other people's posts on the Padlet, and just take advantage of that time to interact. So other than that, I just want to say thank you so much for not only being a part of the 2020 Virtual Summit, but more specifically choosing my sectional. And I hope that you got something out of it and feel like there are things that you can adapt for your own classroom. And again, if you want to reach out to me for any reason whatsoever, please don't hesitate to do so. I love to talk about language teaching and language learning, and I love to geek out about all those things with other teachers. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me for really any reason whatsoever. So I hope you have a wonderful day and a restful summer that is much needed after this crazy end of the school year. So yeah, thank you.